Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. What have you brought to the table today?
I'm bringing an interview between Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and Raychel Gadson. So Dr. Taylor is a well-renowned scholar who has written books called Race for Profit, which is about the real estate industry and black home ownership, and then From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, which makes some connections between the history of black liberation movements and the current movements for Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives and different spaces in that movement. She's also a contributor at The New Yorker and has been writing columns there regularly throughout the last year or so. So she's doing some really great work. And then Raychel Gadson is a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University in the program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship. And so this interview is actually part of a series that publicbooks.org did that considers reading, learning, and writing as politics. So these graduate students choose a public scholar who they admire, and they arrange for an interview. And so this is just, I think, a really great conversation where Dr. Taylor shares a lot. But some specific pieces are her story of how she got to where she is. She points out some organizing that's happening around the country around housing justice specifically. And also she critiques the academy and the Democratic Party by way of comparing them to some things that like right-wing activists have been doing to influence the Republican Party. So there's a lot of good stuff in here that I feel a lot of resonance with in her, how she made her analysis and stuff.
Yeah, same for me, absolutely. And I mean, talk about someone you admire. Good for you, Raychel. Like this was a really great and fascinating conversation between the two of them. And so I'm really glad you found it. I'm glad we get to talk about it, particularly because Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is just incredible, right? Like you mentioned that she's this renowned scholar and author and columnist. She's also a professor at Princeton University in their African American Studies department. And she is this incredible activist as well, right? And so I think she's really just this multifaceted and accomplished person who, can really, hang her hat really well in terms of sort of all that she's given and all that she's done for the fight for Black lives and sort of Black liberation. And so this interview was everything, right? Because I think it was really raw to me, right? I don't think Dr. Taylor held back in so many ways, right? Like she talked about the impacts of institutional and systemic racism in this country, right? You mentioned this, right? She talked about like the state of our current political climate, right? And I loved sort of how she talked about the fact that we've got millionaires and billionaires in Congress and running this country, but so many Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, right? And particularly when you think about the housing justice, as you mentioned, right? Like so many Americans can't afford housing, right? Real adequate, proper housing, right? I also appreciate that she didn't hold back in sharing parts of her personal life with us, right? In her career trajectory, because I think those like personal anecdotes and the sharing of stories and the how and the why of, particularly in the case of Dr. Taylor, right, in this article or this conversation, right, like how and why she's drawn to this work and why it's important to her. Because I think that's so important for those of us who care about and are engaged in this kind of work to hear and to understand and to be inspired by. So I loved this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think as we go through, we'll probably pull out some different specifics that we really probably resonated with and talk about those. So one of the things that stuck out to me that I want to highlight is Dr. Taylor's story. So she told the story about how she would go to class from 8 a.m. to 8:50 a.m. and then get to work by 9 because I guess work was like a mile away from the campus she was taking classes at to finish a bachelor's degree, and then use her lunch break to go to class. and then go to class in the evenings from 6 to 9. And so she did this for 16 months because she wanted to finish her degree and wanted to get out of the job that she was in, but also was driven by wanting to learn why Chicago was so segregated.
Yes.
And so that's a lot of work to do while maintaining a full-time job.
Yes.
So I admire that, and I'm exhausted thinking about it.
Yes.
I know we both did something similar, like in grad school, but that feels different. They're related, but it feels different because our positions were tied to being in grad school. So ultimately there was a lot of built-in flexibility about, Aaron's in class because he's supposed to go to class.
Right.
The point of him being here and doing this job is so he can get a degree.
Yeah.
It's just it's a lot to wrap my mind around in this moment. But from there, got the bachelor's degree and then went to grad school and then ultimately got a doctorate. And as you said, is now a professor at Princeton.
Yeah.
So it's just like a kind of a remarkable story of finding what you want to do in a non-traditional way, and then just kind of going for it
and being like laser focused in that, right? In that pursuit, right? Yeah, I was exhausted too reading that, and you mentioned sort of she was doing this to get out of this job that she had, right? At the time, she was a tenant advocate with the Illinois Tenants Union, right? Which actually, she shared how she actually really enjoyed that job a whole lot, but her boss was apparently just this outright racist, right? And she tells this story about this really awful interaction with her boss. And so, that's certainly difficult for anybody, and particularly as a Black woman, to deal with and work alongside every single day. So I think I admire and respect her pursuing that and getting her bachelor's degree and to propel her to new opportunities and to sort of get out of that toxic space. I appreciate that for sure. And I'm sure others can too. Right. And as you said, right, that took her to grad school, and really, as you said, she dived into really wanting to study Chicago, and particularly like its history with and present day struggles with housing segregation that was taking place there, and overall sort of that housing crisis in the city, right? And I think it really sounds like that was sort of a transformative and pivotal time for her career, right?
Yeah. Well, and one of the things she points out there too is that she was in grad school during like the housing and financial crisis in like 2008.
Yeah.
But that housing crisis hit Black folks like 2 to 3 years before that.
Yeah.
And so she was doing that work before it like sort of hit everywhere.
Yeah.
It hit white folks. And so then it hit the media and was sort of more widespread. And you see the financial collapse of these people who made terrible investments and whatnot. So, but her research interest seems to really have begun in housing justice, which also aligns with like what she was doing while she was getting her bachelor's degree too, right?
Yeah.
So, she mentions that she started to research contract buying in Chicago, where Black people had to get their homes on installment plans rather than traditional mortgages. So there were a lot more ways that you could be exploited in that system.
Yep.
She actually interviewed Clyde Ross, who was one of the people featured in Ta-Nehisi Coates' Their Case for Reparations. And so sort of had done that before that article came out and was on the cusp of doing a lot of this kind of stuff, right? And so she also then sort of shifts and talks about some things in the present day, and the story about mothers seizing properties from the Philadelphia Housing Authority, and just kind of take them over because the city was just sitting on them in the hopes that they could flip them for a profit to a developer at a later date. So, and that's something that's happening more recently, and it's happening in more places than Philly. But it's, infuriating on one part and one part awe-inspiring because those moms moved to the city, right? They created the what they needed.
It wasn't being provided, and they did it.
Yeah. And so the rage for me comes from this push for cities and governments and to be operating like businesses rather than providing services that address the needs of the community, right? And ultimately, government's not really supposed to operate like a business, right? There's not everything in a government's supposed to operate at a profit, right? Services sometimes need to operate at a quote unquote loss because they're a service to the community, right? So the decisions aren't always supposed to be driven by profit. So it's infuriating to think that Philadelphia was just letting some publicly owned houses, right, taxpayer owned houses, sit vacant so they could reap some reward later on when, citizens in the city needed a place to live, and they were like, well, now we're going to make a buck later.
Yeah, right.
So
infuriating is a great word. It was. And personally, I was particularly infuriated to see that was happening in Philly because of a very special place in my heart for Philadelphia. I went to college there. But, as you sort of alluded to, right, Dr. Taylor talked about how this isn't just happening in Philly, or wasn't just happening at the time in Philly. No. She referenced sort of similar stories and the associated sort of activism happening in cities like Oakland and Los Angeles and Kansas City as well. So I think it's important that we know that these sorts of housing injustices are happening across the country, to get us to understand that and to know that that's happening to real people in real cities. And I think, connected to that in this interview was Raychel and Dr. Taylor's conversation about property value and home ownership, right? Mm-hmm. Right. The fact that across the board, and I can't remember what study she cited, but there was a particular study that she cited about this, that homes in Black majority neighborhoods are valued at something like $156 million less than homes in white majority neighborhoods. Yeah. Right. Which is just a ridiculous sort of concept and thing to wrap my head around for a country like ours. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're right. And I love sort of your take on it, right? Like, this all really does speak to this issue or idea that government shouldn't operate like businesses, right? Like, that should not be the goal or the way in which our society operates, I think. And so that's certainly one piece of it. I think as a further element to this, or an expansion on this, right? Like, Dr. Taylor was also talking about all of that in this interview in reference to actually a question that Raychel had asked her about how the pandemic has only made the national housing crisis in this country worse, right? Yeah. So Raychel referenced how before COVID, we already had housing shortages and an incredibly high rental market. Oh, I know that for real. And stagnant wages, right? And I would even go so far as to say that we also have an issue in this country with minimum wage, right? And we're not paying people fair wages for work, right? And so, of course, how can I afford the incredibly high rent that's in places when I'm not even making minimum wage, right? And so, and then back to her question, you introduced the pandemic into all of that, and it's really sort of troublesome to sort of see that this is the ways in which our cities and our governments are operating, and how we're not taking care of our people in our communities. And I think this issue of housing justice for me, is such a critical piece of our fight for social justice and collective liberation, right?
Yeah, because when you have a roof over your head, a lot of other issues become easier to address.
Yes,
in a lot of ways.
Yeah, takes some of that worry. There's still so much to worry about, but the idea of having a roof and sort of a warm place to be and to lay your head, my goodness,
right? Yeah. So one of the other things that's happening is in this article is that I love is connecting history and theory to what's happening right now.
All right, come on,
right? And so I feel like it's a common theme on the show.
Yeah, absolutely.
We talk about it quite a bit. So when Dr. Taylor starts talking about Stokely Carmichael coining institutional racism as a term, and then defining it as racism embedded in governing institutions and private institutions of capital, my interest was piqued further. Yep. And so that definition, therefore, gives Black folks and other, I think, marginalized, oppressed people the right to demand repair, right, through programs and through services that address the harm that's been caused. And so, that's so key, especially when you think about the housing crises that we're facing now. Yep. And that stat you gave about the different valuations of homes, how much of that, I'm guessing probably quite a bit, is from a sort of remnant of redlining, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like sort of specific government disinvestment in Black neighborhoods,
yeah.
That has led that to where it is now, right? Yep. So, I love seeing that theory and stuff come together, and then highlighting how it's good. Specifically the Stokely Carmichael thing and institutional racism, systemic racism becoming more of a term, a more popular term.
Yes.
Culturally, and how that's good for our overall analysis and collective understanding that racism is institutional, right? It is systemic.
Yes.
That's a big reason why there's backlash from the right, because nobody wants to address these larger harms, because it's going to be really expensive to address stuff like healthcare and housing and education. And that money is, mostly going to get sent to and funneled to folks of color, which, also the right would have a problem with.
Doesn't want.
And so this brings me to this quote from the interview. That's why the resistance to structural analyses like Carmichael's was sharply focused on issues of personal responsibility and redirecting the conversation away from institutions and structures back to families, behavior, and culture, right? So if the right can redefine the issues as one that belongs to the outcomes, belong to the individuals, then they don't have to address the roots of the problem, right? So then the problems continue and evolve. And that's where the reactions from the right have been for decades now and, continue to be now, right? So it's very interesting, especially to think about the policies that like presidents started to implement and like, you think back to some of the famous sound bites of like Ronald Reagan around personal responsibility. And, he coined, speechwriter, somebody coined welfare queen as an example. And so thinking like there's a lot of shift in the individual and lionizing the individual as the beginning and end of these social issues. And that's I think that's been a consistent cultural movement from the right to have us focus more on the individual. And so I think that's why she highlights that it's super important that even if we can't name specific examples, right, like popularly of systemic or institutional racism, the fact that it's in our lexicon again more popularly is important because it's going to let us push back on some of this individualized stuff.
Absolutely. I think that's so key, this individualized stuff. I also want to say, as a funny aside, when you said Ronald Reagan, it took everything in me not to make the Ted Lasso joke.
The actor?
The actor?
You Doc Brown me.
Sorry, folks. We're having a serious conversation here. But you're right. I think this was one of the most important and profound parts of this interview, right? And I love the sort of work you just did to talk about the individual, right? And that has been they've been laser focused in sort of trying to blame this on the individual. And again, to our earlier conversation, not thinking about sort of the humanity of our communities, right? And what is in the best interest of our communities, right? That's where we should be focused, not defining the issue, as you say, to the individual.
Yep.
Yeah. So, this conversation about institutional and systemic racism, like we've had lots of conversations here about that and consumed lots of media that have shared the ways that, that these things are at the core of so many of our problems and our conditions that exist in this country. So, yeah, I think I think that in particular was another critical takeaway from this interview for sure. And, at the end of the conversation, Raychel sort of mentioned how and I think connected to this, mentioned the emergence of mutual aid systems, right, in organizations, right, and how they've been so amazing in trying to help make real, impactful, on the ground change for people, right, to make people's lives better, and to do what we're supposed to be doing here in terms of taking care of one another, right, because time and time again we've seen such inability from our government. And as you sort of mentioned when we talk about the right, maybe just sort of a lack of even desire or care to do that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This sort of, I think that's so important to think about how folks responded to the crisis of the pandemic by reaching out to their neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people did,
Yeah.
right? Because I think that's a cultural shift from that individualized thing.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that's so key to think about and maybe focus on of how do we capture this and continue to encourage it.
Yes.
Right. So shifting us a little bit, one of the pieces of this conversation that they had was this comparison to the right and the left, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. In the respective political parties or lack thereof of each of those sort of sides.
Yeah.
Was really interesting because the right has, I think we've talked about this quite a bit on the show in different ways, but the way that she talks about it like really crystallized it for me. The right's coalesced around this idea of a culture war and, reducing taxes. And that's really been their overarching narrative for decades. Building the war machine, reducing taxes on the wealthy, and then, culture war stuff. And so the GOP has mostly aligned itself with that because that's where the right has been. And the left is essentially, we're stuck with the Democratic Party, which mostly doesn't align with what people actually want, whether they're on the left or just, people, the general public, right? I mean, this week it was revealed that Nancy Pelosi thought that a wealth tax was a publicity stunt in the bill that they're considering, Build Back Better. So she was more aligned with Manchin than a majority of this country, which has polled, like a wealth tax is polled pretty popularly with. So I also appreciated in this conversation tying together racism and capitalism too, because she says, and I quote, social dislocation means people don't know where they fit. Immigration is something that gets the blame, and it's totally racist, and it is about class and economics, right? It's both at the same time. Race and class are entwined in this country, and the constant efforts to separate the two create confusion because you can't separate them.
Right.
Especially when you think about this, and this is my thought here. When we think about the narrative around Trump supporters and saying that it's either all about race or it's all about class, when it's absolutely about both, particularly when we think about immigration and people blaming immigration for the lack of jobs and whatnot, right? So
absolutely.
Yeah.
It was difficult not to wince when you said some of those names, right? Like Pelosi and Manchin and Trump, right? Like, I think, when you consider all of this, it's really just not difficult to see how our elected officials in our government really just aren't serving us in the ways that they should be. And so, the other thing that they referenced in this conversation was talking about that insurrection that happened, right? January 6th at the Capitol, right? And that incident and sort of that terrorist attack, really, because that's what it was, is, I think, just another perfect example of how and why separating race and class is troublesome, right?
Right.
And that work being done to try to separate race and class is just one of the many reasons why that insurrection happened. So, there's so much sort of real life connection to all of this.
Yeah, there's so much bundled up in all of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, this feels like a good spot to shift into and talk about application.
Yeah.
So I think my application is a little abstract here again, but I think understanding how these politics outside of electoral politics in particular, and outside of the parties, influence the parties, like how that works.
Yeah.
I think understanding that is super important because we have to see these patterns.
Yes.
And I think I'm especially drawn to understanding the reactionary stuff on the right and how and why we don't see similar stuff on the left, right? The right has had so many people over the years push them further right very publicly.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Right. So Rush Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson and lots more who have pushed the envelope of what's an acceptable political position for decades.
Yeah.
And then they've gathered these large audiences and then influenced the GOP to adopt these kinds of positions because then sort of the voters appreciate these positions in some way because they attach the, like, they've taken them on because they listen to these people.
Yeah.
Now we have people chanting at a NASCAR race, and U.S. senators are using it in their tweets, right? So, and then members of the House are creating videos where they are murdering their political opponents.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And I know I've talked about this stuff before in the past, but I feel like it's always relevant to try to understand.
It's happening
this
week. Like it's happening now. Absolutely, it's relevant. Yeah.
And it's just not happening the same way on the left, right? And people try to make these equivalencies that I think are false. We don't have establishment people getting pushed to the left because they're watching CNN or reading the New York Times, because those outlets aren't actually leftist.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like they get labeled that way by the right as a way to sort of destabilize them and reduce their reputation.
Yeah.
But, so we're led to believe that they are left, but, they're not. So I think my application here is to use some of the ways that Dr. Taylor is analyzing the world, and trying to bring that critique into, our own work, our own day-to-day kind of stuff, and understanding what's going on. And I don't know how to translate that into doing something about it, but,
No, but
it's a first step, I guess.
I think that's great application, my man. I wouldn't call that abstract at all, because I think that is, particularly as we think about, oh my gosh, the like horrific things we're seeing, folks tweet about, right? And these videos that you reference, right? Like of folks murdering their political opponents. Like that stuff's happening right now. And it's deplorable isn't even strong enough of a word to describe that and what's going on. So I think you're picking up on exactly what Dr. Taylor was putting down here in terms of what is and what is not happening in our two parties. And so I think that's a key piece of application to take away from this as it relates to what's happening right now in our society. I think another piece of maybe connected application is this idea that Dr. Taylor presented at the end of the interview around making academic work accessible, right? And so to me, I think it's so important that the work that Dr. Taylor and others are doing and publishing on liberation movements, and even broader than that and connected to that, the stuff we're talking about and reading about and absorbing around abolition, right? And sort of broader social justice issues, right? Like what is being written about the real tangible solutions to some of the ills of our society and the ways in which we could make our society better. Like that needs to be more accessible and understood by all of us, right? I think that's important work that needs to continue to happen, right? And so I'm glad she referenced that. I think that was one of the last questions that Raychel asked her about in this interview.
Yeah, absolutely. She talks about the ways that, again, I think this individualistic stuff leads to, in some ways, things becoming less accessible because you have to participate, right? Like to be a thinker, you have to participate in growing an audience so that you can then find funding from, right? And so, Whew. All right. Well, so for homework, let's talk about that for a little bit. I think one of my pieces of homework is to reread How We Get Free. So that's a book that Dr. Taylor edited about the Kamihi River Collective Statement, which is where the term identity politics was coined. And that book was published by Haymarket. And so this is pulled from the webpage about it. The Kamihi River Collective, a path-breaking group of radical black feminists, was one of the most important organizations to develop out of the anti-racist and women's liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s. In this collection of essays and interviews edited by activist scholar Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, founding members of the organization and contemporary activists reflect on the legacy of its contributions to black feminism and its impact on today's struggles. So I read the book a few years ago, but I'd love to get back to it. So that might be foreshadowing for future things to bring to the table.
Absolutely.
But I also, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation is a book that she read too, and it's been in my to-read pile for a while now. So that's also something to maybe get to as homework.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, shout out to Haymarket Books. We love them around here. But also, that's my homework too. Particularly the Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation book. I actually haven't read it. It's been on my list for quite a while now. I think it came out back in 2016.
Yeah, a second edition actually is recently just came out too. So there's an update.
That. All right.
I don't know what all the updates are, but there's a second edition.
I didn't know that either. So look, we're all learning things together here, right? But I think there's so much about that and what was happening in 2016 that's still relevant today, right? And so this description, I wanted to read it. It's from the 2016 version. I again didn't know that there's an update, but so the description of the book is. The eruption of mass protests in the wake of the police murders of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Garner in New York City have challenged the impunity with which officers of the law carry out violence against Black people and punctured the illusion of a post-racial America. The Black Lives Matter movement has awakened a new generation of activists. In this stirring and insightful analysis, activist and scholar Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor surveys the historical and contemporary ravages of racism and persistence, of structural inequality, such as mass incarceration and Black unemployment. In this context, she argues that this new struggle against police violence holds the potential to reignite a broader push for Black liberation. So I think there's a lot of incredible stuff. There's got to be a lot of incredible stuff in this book. So that's my homework, is to definitely get this book finally and get it read for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe some other foreshadowing.
Hey.
Something to bring to the table.
I love it.
Yeah. All right. So, Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I am. Yes, sir. All right. So for our next episode, I'm bringing a piece that was featured in The New Yorker back in June. So just a few months old here, by Benjamin Wallace Wells, who's a contributor to The New Yorker. And I think he writes for some other Rolling Stone and some other places and publications. The piece is called How a Conservative Activist Invented the Conflict Over Critical Race Theory. And, to be fully transparent, I haven't read any of it yet, but I was intrigued by it because of what I do know about it is that it's a response to Christopher Rufo. And if that name sounds familiar, we actually talked about Mr. Rufo when we had our previous episode. I think it was the first time we actually talked about in depth critical race theory on the show, maybe a few months ago now at this point, right? And so in this piece, Benjamin Wallace Wells walks us through some of Christopher Rufo's misguided efforts to attack critical race theory, and he also does some work to share some of the conversations he has with critical race theory scholars. Like he actually talks to Kimberly Crenshaw about their response to all of this, and so I think it's going to be another way for us to keep talking positively about critical race theory, right? And the importance of it, and who knows, maybe we'll bring some other things to the conversation. And critical race theory continues to be in the news every other day, right? So I know this maybe came out back in June, but I'm sure there's lots of sort of present day things we can talk about with this. So I'm looking forward to fully reading the article and talking about it with you next time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to be one of the newest fronts on the culture war by the right. So it is a constant bugaboo.
Yes.
All right. Well, we want to thank you today for joining us and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but you might have forgotten. Please follow, leave a rating and a review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we got going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Folks, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. We'll talk to you next week.